Indie Game Garden.
Dustin Andrews is the lead designer and artist of HorrorVale, a miraculous and spooky turn-based RPG set in the underworld. The streets are crawling with vampires, ghouls, ghosts, and more, but really, the happy place is the place for these classic monsters. The trouble comes when more modern creepypasta and modern horror-based monsters enter. They're called the creepies, and you have to go figure out why the hell they've come to disturb the peace of all the well-respected vampires and ghouls and witches. We're so excited to have Dustin on for a conversation about horror, JRPGs, the way pets can inspire creativity, and a whole lot more. So let's get to it. Well, Dustin, I'm so excited to have you on today.
I'm excited to be on.
And I wanted to start by talking about your road to game development. What drew you to games, and would you mind providing like a rundown of your work to date and your interest to date for my listeners so we're all on the same page?
Yeah, of course. So honestly, I would consider myself very much an amateur in game development. I've played games all my life, obviously, even since I was a little kid playing like Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64, all that kind of stuff. I did, growing up, I messed around with RPG Maker a little bit, but never like really like making a full long project. HorrorVale is certainly the first game that I've ever made. And a lot of that, I feel like there was a very rough road to getting that complete, because I was basically starting from scratch, trying to figure out game design and stuff like that. Not going to school for it, not having any experience, and having to kind of try to figure that stuff out on my own, which I feel like in some places in the game, it definitely shows. Let's put it that way.
In spite of how you might feel about like amateurishness or like different levels of polish on the game, I think from where I'm sitting, like that journey is perhaps the most like inspiring and interesting to hear about overall, because like I think a lot of us sitting here in our homes listening to this are like, we're a game enthusiasts, we're game players, and we've all had that, you know, urge to kind of like, maybe one day, or like maybe one day I'll make one or try experimenting with making one. And I think like you'll hear a lot in the space, like, well, there are plenty of tools, there are plenty of tutorials, so like that won't be your problem. But then I also feel like in tension with that and kind of in opposition to that, a lot of the engines that you open up can just be so impenetrable, and a lot of the tutorials don't really teach you how to work with the engine. They teach you how to like copy the code on the screen and then have that be the product, and then you're kind of left with just like, well, I learned how to copy code on a screen. And so I was wondering if we could just like dig in a little bit more to like the process of making HorrorVale, as far as like, I know you did all of the art, and is it an RPG Maker game? I couldn't tell, which is a compliment for RPG Maker games.
It is an RPG Maker. Yeah. So to give kind of like a little backstory, I have a friend of mine named Matt who did all of the music in the game, and we've been friends going back since we were 13 on like IRC chats. And I went into HorrorVale as someone who was experienced in art, not in game design or programming or anything like that. And he was wanting to pursue a career in like composing music for games. And so we always kind of had this like thing that we threw around, like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we like made our own game? Like I could do the art, you could do the music, that kind of stuff. And one Halloween, like October in 2016, I randomly got this idea of what if there was I just kind of like pitched it to him as like just, you know, a random idea I had one afternoon. Like, what if there was a very like traditional cookie cutter like fantasy JRPG with like knights and dragons and the typical plot points and stuff, but the whole gimmick of it is it has a very spooky twist on it. And that was the whole basic concept that started HorrorVale. And we kind of went from there, just not really seriously thinking that I was going to make anything. We were just kind of messing around. I was messing around in RPG Maker. He was coming up with little concepts for music for it. And for like 2 years, I kind of had it on the back burner. I wasn't really seriously developing it. I was working on a webcomic at the time, and that was where my focus was at. And then when we released the demo, that was kind of like when people started playing it for the first time, that kind of flipped the switch and was like, oh, we should probably like take this very seriously. And that's kind of how that started. And I will say, certainly, if it were not for the fact that I developed an RPG Maker, I'm not sure that it would have existed because of that high barrier of learning other things. Like recently, I started digging into like Godot and learning how that works. And I feel like if I didn't have my experience with RPG Maker, it would have been like 10 times harder to try to get into that, because RPG Maker, it has like the event system, which is in some ways like a very rudimentary version of programming, setting up things. It helps you learn like how things are structured, how to structure things, especially if you do anything like super like advanced, like mini games and things like that. There's a lot that goes into it. RPG Maker is certainly a great way to get into game development, because it does solve a lot of it allows you to get something visual on the screen that you're controlling and playing a lot faster than something where you would have to actually create a lot of those systems yourself.
Well, that's actually the follow-up question I was going to ask, is like, would you recommend, and it doesn't need to be like an ironclad recommendation or anything like this, but it sounds like your experience was that something a little bit more like, not necessarily plug and play, but something easier to get working out of the box created a really nice stepping stone to, eventually messing around with one of the, more talked about engines, as far as like a Unity or a Godot or what have you.
Yeah.
And that is really cool to hear, because I feel like one of the things that I read about and hear about a lot in especially beginner game development is like, you just have to choose and do something and start, right? Because if you just like keep looking around and keep like worrying about where you're going to start, that can get super overwhelming and then you won't make anything. And I think, a lot of the time people will look at something like RPG Maker and compare it to something like Unity, and it'll be like, well, I should probably just learn Unity because that's what I'll eventually want to be working in anyway. And then like that can get overwhelming really quickly. So I think it's cool to hear the perspective of like, you can treat it as almost more of a stepping stone and less of a locking yourself into one thing or the other.
It is absolutely a great door to open, like to way to get the door open to game development. And certainly, one of the most common advices that you see from game devs everywhere is to start small. Obviously, I didn't really follow that advice, but I don't necessarily recommend that to everyone, to make a 40, 50 hour RPG right out of the gate. But certainly digging into RPG, even if you're not necessarily going to make a completed game and put it out, just messing with that can still help make it easier to get into other engines later down the road.
Closing the loop on RPG Maker and like what you were able to do with it for this project, I was fascinated by the fact, like, I think there's kind of a meme with RPG Maker in particular where it's like, oh, you can tell they're using all of the like pre-made assets and every game looks the same and what have you. Which is why I think it's so cool that HorrorVale is an example of an RPG Maker game that is so stylish and unique in its style relative to others I've seen. And so I was wondering if you could speak to the process of taking your expertise in art and your obvious interest in game art and kind of grafting it onto the existing formula that RPG Maker has? Was it easy to kind of import your own assets and make use of them? Was there some clunkiness there? I would love to hear about that process just because it's something I'm not familiar with.
Well, so I had a very small amount of experience in pixel art
Mm-hmm.
going in. Just messing around with it here and there. I definitely had more experience with, non-pixel art. And
Mm-hmm.
there was certainly a kind of a learning curve going into, because HorrorVale has kind of a very unique way that it handles its art compared to a lot of other RPG Maker games. So for a lot of other RPG Maker games, they use tile sets, which is where you create all of these tiles that you can then add into the game, like basically so you can easily create maps without having to do them all manually. But the problem that I had was I didn't like how that really limits the way you can add detail and like do specific shading and stuff like that. So instead of doing tile sets in HorrorVale, all of the maps are completely hand drawn. So in my art program, I have like a 32 by 32 grid, and I have to try to think about scaling and stuff like that. And I basically just draw them all just like that from completely from scratch. And
Wow.
it's certainly number one, it makes it more difficult to go back and change things if I need to. But there
Yeah.
was certainly a learning curve involved with figuring out like scaling and level design and stuff like that. I feel like a lot of the like early game maps in HorrorVale, if you look at them, so a lot of them I went back and edited, but they're very like big and spacious and taking up a lot of space for no reason, and you end up running around. I had this strange idea in my head that I wanted all of the exteriors of buildings to fit how the interior was. You know how a lot of games you go into, you have this small
Mm,
house and you go to it and it's really big, and I
right.
wanted to avoid that, and it ended up making the maps way too big. So you spend more time walking than anything else. And so that was certainly a learning curve. I, I feel like it, because I developed the game act by act, like I went one, two, three, the further you get into the game, the better that the game design gets, and you
Mm.
feel like there's a lot more intention. You can see the experience building up as you go further in.
That's really fascinating. And while it's really meaningful for me to hear that, and now as a player, I'm somewhere in Act Two, so I'll continue to
Mm,
think about that as I get further. Um, it must be meaningful for you as kind of a, you're doing this as a passion project developer to be able
mm,
to see that in the product that you made as well and feel kind of inspired moving forward. And it's nice that it tracks that way,
yeah.
poetic in a way, in my mind. Um, HorrorVale is a love letter to the horror genre, it seems like, and features references to like classic movie monsters,
Mm.
creepy pastas, video game ghouls, all types of stuff. And I was wondering like what your history is with horror, and what led you to this current iteration of HorrorVale, because it sounds like starting out it was more of a like let's do fantasy setting with some monsters thrown in. What led you
Hmm.
to kind of the full on Halloweeniness that we have now?
So growing up, I was always into like horror stuff. As a kid, you had your Nightmare Before Christmas, Courage the Cowardly Dog,
Yeah.
Luigi's Mansion. Obviously, I feel like Luigi's Mansion really informs like the tone of HorrorVale, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like very like goofy horror.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't say, because for HorrorVale, I always intended an audience of like PG-13, like teenagers kind of thing. So it's kind of like
Yeah.
a tame horror, but it's still a
Hmm.
little bit spooky. And so growing up, I always had a fascination with like horror and Halloween and stuff like that. I'm a big aficionado of like classic Universal films, like the original 1930s, like Dracula, Frankenstein, that kind of stuff. I collect horror films. I'm it does get a little bit disappointing because now I'm at a point where I don't get scared by those kind of things anymore, but I still enjoy watching them and thinking about the atmosphere that they're creating, the creature designs, the cinematography, the shots, that kind of stuff. That kind of goes through my head. And
Yeah.
so even when I was a teenager, I would doodle all over my schoolwork, like jack-o'-lanterns and ghosts and skeletons and stuff. So it's always kind of been in there. So it felt very natural going in to kind of create something like that in a game. And for HorrorVale, certainly I started with this kind of idea of a traditional JRPG, fantasy JRPG with like monsters and stuff. And that's kind of reflected. You can still see some of that in like character design. So like the main four characters are all traditional classic RPG classes. So like Alice is a witch, Bolt is
Yeah.
a knight, Webbs is a bowman, Beatrice is a rogue. And how that kind of really changed a little bit is I was creating enemy designs and just to kind of get a feel for thing. And I created all of these like very goofy parodies of like creepy pastas. So like the
Mm-hmm.
Slender Man, but it was the tall guy, and Sonic.exe, but it was Speedster.png. Just kind of messing around with enemy concepts. And then I got the idea of creating this story about where you have like this world of horror where all these traditional spooks like skeletons and zombies and stuff, they all live happily, but they're suddenly invaded by this new horror in the form of the creepies, which are all parodies of creepy pastas that are meant to represent modern horror, internet horror, that kind of stuff. Um, and that was kind of the basis for the story going in, because HorrorVale is honestly really like a love letter to horror. I know that for many players, seeing a game with a lot of references, for some players, it's very like kind of cringy. Like
Mm.
a lot of people don't really like it when the references seem to be like they're just there just for people to point at and go like, oh, I recognize that thing. But for
Yeah.
HorrorVale, it's really like baked into what it's meant to represent as I really consider it not necessarily a horror game, but a celebration of horror or a horror themed game, because that's
Yeah.
really, really celebrating the genre is everywhere. There's later a segment, not to spoil you too much, but there is a segment that's like a murder mystery. There's segments where you're
Oh,
being
so
chased
cool.
by monsters. There's a lot of stuff in there that's very reminiscent of horror, like horror games, horror movies, all kinds of stuff, and certainly the horror is just so baked into everything, every aspect of it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I often think about as also a fan of the horror genre is how like a lot of the time the best horror is like has a meta layer to it anyway, and it seems
Mm,
like the meta-ness of HorrorVale as far as like being a celebration of horror and like laughing at itself, um it almost reinforces the like love letter nature or the celebration of horror in that way
yeah.
too, because it's doing a lot of the same things that I think some of my favorite horror films do, um
Mm,
while also having, it's never like you're never scared
yeah.
watching it, or playing it, I should say. But you are, if you're into horror genre in any type of way, you are inspired and you are like endeared very much to the characters and to the creator, I would say. So I think
Mm,
you've done a great job of balancing that tone and that goal, with
yeah.
what is there on the screen.
Yeah. And in terms of tone, certainly, going into what you were saying about like horror movies and stuff, uh, I often think about like Rocky Horror Picture Show, Little Shop of
Mm.
Horrors, in terms of tone that HorrorVale has, because those are very prominent films that very much parody other horror films. It's a big part of their
Right.
identity, and I kind of liken it to that, um, in terms of tone and the comedy and stuff.
Those are great reference points, I think, as far as, yeah, evoking kind of what I was trying to express.
Hmm.
And while we're on this topic, I was wondering, like you said, you collect horror films and you're obviously an aficionado. What are some of like your favorite entries in the genre that you might recommend to someone who's listening that has an interest in horror?
Well, probably my favorite horror film of all time is the original Dracula 1930s, but I'm not really sure that that would be a good entry point for horror for somebody. It's very much a product of its time, and I feel like the stuff that is very scary in that film is not things that, like, I don't think it's going to scare anybody in the modern day. We're so
Yeah.
desensitized to modern horror films. Beyond that, I'm a big fan of, like, I feel like the 1980s were the absolute best time for horror films. You know, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Halloween. All of those are very much like precious in my heart, and I love the tone of those films and the soundtracks and stuff like that. Um, Modern horror, I feel like it doesn't have as much of the same spice. There was one film that I really liked called It Follows. I thought, which
Hmm.
actually borrowed a lot from the '80s horror films of like the tone and the way it's set up. I think that's a fantastic film. Hereditary was another modern film that I liked a lot. Um, I don't know. It's really hard for me to necessarily recommend a film because I feel like the genre is so wide that there's something out there for everybody depending on what you want. But
Yeah.
perhaps I would say like the classic 1980s stuff. Like you can't go wrong. Like anybody can jump into Halloween and have a good time.
True. Yeah, and it's a good representation too of like, while I think some of those classic films now are thought of as like camp, I think
Mm-hmm.
like they are emblematic of the fact that like all great art is just like
Mm-hmm.
made in earnest, you know? And like
Yeah.
there's an earnest tone to a lot of the stuff that before we were getting a lot of like self-referential horror, kind of like the Scream idea. We were
Mm-hmm.
just getting like go ham in this movie and see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like the slasher film is almost a lost art. A lot of horror films are nowadays are afraid to have like this one central goofy monster that's chasing a bunch of people. I think maybe one exception would be like Terrifier in recent memory.
Mm. Well, great. Those are some good recs. And pivoting now to the other main inspiration for HorrorVale,
Mm-hmm.
it obviously owes a lot of its structure to Titans in the turn-based RPG genre, the JRPG genre.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Mother 3 a lot while I'm playing it. But I was wondering, like, what would you say is HorrorVale's largest inspiration in that vein? What are some of your like their JRPGs that you hold up as the main inspirations?
Yeah, I think that looking to Mother 3 is a very apt observation. Certainly, I think when a lot of people initially look at HorrorVale, they think of Earthbound or Undertale, but I would say that it definitely borrows a lot more from Mother 3 than those games. It also, I feel like it borrows a lot from really like the classic Final Fantasies. I love those games so much.
Yeah.
I love the feeling of like a grand adventure that you get from those classic Final Fantasy games. And additionally, there's a lot of Pokemon in there too, believe it or not.
Yeah.
I feel like HorrorVale and Pokemon are kind of in a similar vein where they're RPGs that somebody who doesn't like RPGs could play. So if you're not,
Right.
they're very entry level. They don't expect necessarily a lot of you, but if you really dig into it and like you do like really really like RPGs, there's still a underside of a lot of depth. In Horrorville in particular, like in the in game, like with the secret bosses and stuff like that, there's also a dream coliseum you can unlock to really like
Mm.
push you to your limits and have to experiment and actually understand the mechanics. But for somebody just going in, it's very simple to understand. And in terms of similarities to Pokemon, uh, I almost feel like the whole party member collection thing is almost like Pokemon, like collecting Pokemon, and they all have their own elements and their own abilities and stuff like that. And you kind of have to think
Right.
about how you want to build your team and which ones are your favorites and stuff like that. Not to mention the whole element system.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead and talk more about that. I was just gonna pivot to that and say like in addition to it being entry level insofar as being accessible, I think it's
Mhm.
also cool that you like build the horror and self-referential nature into the element system where it's like
Mhm.
healing does damage and like poisoning
Yeah.
heals, and there are like cute things like that that keep folks interested even beyond like a more simple formula.
Yeah. HorrorVale, a lot of the times, it takes itself kind of seriously in that the the saving system is built in the lore. So when you die, you reappear at the bed where you saved. You respawn, like as if you just loaded the game. And with the element system, I really wanted to have a very unorthodox element system. So instead of like fire, water, air, earth, you've got flesh and blood and bone and sugar and stuff like that. And characters will even reference it in the game and stuff like that. They're very aware of like almost aware of like the systems in place and stuff like that.
I was just thinking about JRPGs a lot for this
Mm-hmm.
episode, and how a lot of game critics that I really respect are, with kind of this new resurgence of like you see the Dragon Quest getting HD 2D
Mm-hmm.
remakes, and you see basically a lot of classic games from the Super Nintendo era getting like remade, and even the NES era getting remade, and kind of getting polished up. And a lot of what I'm hearing these days is like, well, I don't enjoy the gameplay at its core,
Mm-hmm.
and so I like can't get into it, or like it's boring. I'll just play like whatever. Um, but one of the things that I really connected with, and that HorrorVale seems very aware of throughout its runtime, as far as I've gotten, is like the way to enjoy a more like a classic or something that is harkening back to the classic JRPGs is like steeping yourself not only in the game and its mechanics and what's there,
Mm-hmm.
but also in this kind of imaginary world that you have going on. Like, I think a lot
Mm-hmm.
of what people find really relaxing and interesting and endearing about like Dragon Quest 1, the first Final Fantasies, the things we think about when we just think about, like cookie cutter JRPG is like there's the graphics on screen, but they're like not representative enough to prevent the imagination from also like kicking
Mm-hmm.
in and like filling in the gaps. And I think that
Yeah.
that's something that like HorrorVale is aware of and like plays around with a lot of these playful mechanics we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, while also, being a lot more modern and an easier entry into the genre. And so I just think that it's brilliant that it can do both those things. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I will say that personally, going back to RPGs, a lot of people don't really like the traditional RPGs, but I've always felt like when you want to play something that's not necessarily super intense, that you can just sit back and relax. I find like turn-based RPGs very relaxing. I know
Me
some of
too.
them have like the active time battle thing, but if it's completely turn based and it's not necessarily based off of reaction time and stuff like that. It's very chill. You don't have to think about it too hard, except for like boss battles and stuff like that. And that's certainly the kind of vibe I wanted in HorrorVale. I wanted it to be kind of like a comfy game you just put on, you relax for a few hours, you have fun, engrossing yourself in this world and that kind of stuff. Um, in terms of accessibility, it was very important to me to constantly keep things fresh because I feel like in a lot of RPGs, you go into a dungeon and you're fighting the same enemies over and over and over and over and over, and a lot of the areas look the same. So going into HorrorVale, a lot of thought was put into making almost every single map uh, to be unique, recognizable,
Mm.
not only to make it easier to remember where things are and get around the world, but just keep the senses fresh. to keep so you're not staring at the same thing over and over again. In that vein, a lot of the enemies are very unique. There's like hundreds and hundreds of enemies in HorrorVale. Some of them you will fight once and then never again. And it's not even a boss or a mini boss. It's just a regular enemy that you find. There are a few places, especially in optional areas, where it deviates that from it just a little bit, where you might see some enemies like that you fight several times. But for the most part in the game, I try to constantly keep it fresh. And I think that really does help a lot with players who maybe aren't used to RPGs or don't really like RPGs to still stay engaged in it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Another really engaging part of the game that I super appreciated and thought was extremely unique relative to some of the examples and inspirations we've mentioned to date is like your art. And I know you talked about a slightly unorthodox way of drawing the maps. And I'm also interested in like the character design and the monster design, because your art toes the line between like cute and creepy. We've kind of discussed how you didn't want it to be like a horrifying game, but you wanted it to be a celebration of horror. But it toes that line between cute and creepy in a way that is like charming and I think very unique, as far as like it's almost somewhere between it. Like to me, it reads as somewhere between like hand drawn and pixel art, in a way. And I was wondering, like, how did you land on this art style? Is it kind of how you've always drawn and representative of your experience in art, or did you have to focus on learning it and adapting it to the game specifically?
So I definitely think that the art style that is in HorrorVale was something that was developed for HorrorVale during the development, because going in, I typically the kind of stuff that I drew before that was very much kind of like anime inspired. So if you go back and look at like early concept art for HorrorVale, the characters are proportioned like way different. Like Alice is like tall and slender. And she's way less like chibi and cute. And then over time, as I continued making concepts for the game and art for the game, she shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And certainly in terms of character design, I always wanted to, above all, I like to create characters that are appealing to look at. And so even things that are supposed to be like kind of scary or unnerving, I still try to make them pop and be interesting to look at. Certainly, going back to Luigi's Mansion again, that kind of like creepy cute is certainly something that was going in mind with HorrorVale. And something else that really changed over time and something that developed in HorrorVale was the shading system and stuff like that, because the kind of way that I like shaded and did lighting and stuff like that in my traditional art was a lot more like paintlery, kind of like a lot more gradual color change. But I found that through developing HorrorVale and making art for HorrorVale, that stricter and stronger shading really popped out a lot more, especially for smaller sprites. And that was a learning curve for me as I was developing the art style.
Yeah, very cool to hear, and I appreciate you describing that process. What are some of your game design core values? I know you said you were coming to it originally from an art side and not having as much of a background in design or development, and I was wondering if you could like describe your own, self-described trajectory of like the game design improving from act to act, and what you learned along the way, and if you can point to like specific designers you've studied or games that have influenced you in this realm.
Yeah. So, I mean, going in, I think that something that a lot of people getting into video games, especially if they're doing it on the basis of like a small team, like one or two people, something that they don't often think about is game design. I feel like it's something it's something that's very much overlooked by players, because good game design, you don't notice it. Like you don't think about good game design. You only notice it when it's really bad. So for me, things like how should I design this area? Where should I put the enemies? How should I break it up? What kind of puzzles could I put in? That's all kind of stuff that I just kind of had to wing it in a lot of cases. And I definitely feel like there are some cases where it worked really well in HorrorVale, and areas that it didn't work not so well. Like I mentioned, the very early game areas that were very wide and open, and it certainly gets better over time. In terms of like games, whose game design I was inspired by, I think that if you like look at a screenshot of HorrorVale and you look at the combat, the first thought for many people, like I said, is going to be like Earthbound, Undertale, that kind of stuff. But then if you actually dig deep into, like, if you play HorrorVale and you really think about its systems and its game design and progression and stuff like that, there's very much a very big like Legend of Zelda influence in there, particularly Majora's Mask. The way that dungeons are laid out, the way that you progress through the game, the way goals are laid out. And in the case of Majora's Mask, that's a game where half of the content is side content.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like in a lot of games, especially RPGs, side quests and side content are often just like, they're not necessarily things that the developer is spending a lot of time on. They're just kind of
Right.
there to have a little bit of something extra to fill up some space. You know, you'll have a side quest where you have to go kill 10 enemies. But in the case of Majora's Mask and also HorrorVale, the side content is the game. So you can certainly ignore all the side quests and the characters in HorrorVale and just go straight to the ending and probably have a fine time. But going back to those and exploring those areas and meeting those characters really enriches the experience, because I wanted to make those feel like they were meaningful to do. I didn't want to. I didn't want. There are some side quests which are better than others. And when you have a game where there's 60 side quests, some of them are going to be a little bit weaker than others. But by and large, I really wanted to make each one feel like it was something that was worth doing. Either you would go somewhere new and experience a new dungeon or new enemies or bosses, or you would meet new characters and at the very least have interesting dialogue as a reward for doing the side quest. And what I found is, going into developing the game, I kind of thought, okay, maybe like some players will do some of the side quests and a very small percentage will do all of them. Like only like 0.05% are going to 100% this game. But the feedback that I keep getting is a lot of players feel compelled to do everything. And I think something that HorrorVale does that's kind of like a clever trick to that is it really likes lists. So you have a side quest list, and it's not just a list of quests that you have started and stuff like that. It has a list of every side quest in the game is like a question mark. And it also shows you which ones are available in red. So you can see which ones you can do, where to start them, and what you get from them. And that kind of game design was a little bit inspired by RuneScape, which does a similar thing with its quests in its games. And in the party member selection screen, you have all these silhouettes crossing the whole screen. So there's almost this psychology in the player's mind of like, oh, well, I want to see what all those are. And then they end up doing all the side content. Probably a very common positive piece of feedback that I get from players is, I don't usually 100% games, but I 100% it all of HorrorVale because I felt like I had to.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it's cool to hear that as a designer you've taken, bits and pieces from all of these very classic games, RuneScape, Majora's Mask, like some of the early Final Fantasies. Like, these are all games that, anyone even with a slight interest in games would like at least know the name of, if not played 100 hours of. And I just think it's so cool that I think a lot of games are like bound to like, well, I did, a PS1 graphic style, and I did, a Silent Hill type of game, and that's the game. But it's cool that you've taken all of these disparate influences and brought them together in a package that I think is really endearing. If you could pass on one or a few tips to like aspiring creatives, game designers in 2026, what would it be? I guess in particular, I'm interested, since you have had this experience, going from someone who's just like, well, I might want to make games, but I'm not sure where to start, going from that
Mm-hmm.
to trying to get a project under your belt.
Yeah. So a philosophy that I've always had with any kind of creative work is to not aim for perfection. I feel like when somebody is a player or a consumer of art or media, they, since they're an outside observer, they're more apt to notice mistakes or things that are wrong with it and think like, oh, I could have done that so much better, or I would have done this. And then when they move into a space where they're creating art or creating games or music or whatever, I think a bad tendency that a lot of new people can have is to aim for perfection because they don't want to end up like those bad movies or those bad games. So they're constantly overthinking things. They're constantly going back and fixing things. It's honestly, if you're not careful, it can very much be a never ending cycle where you're constantly finding things wrong, constantly trying to fix things. But even like the best games of all time, the developer teams, which can have like hundreds and thousands of people working on it with strict deadlines, even your favorite games of all time, there are cases where they said, okay, well, this may not be perfect, but it just kind of has to exist. And
Yeah.
it's certainly sometimes you just have to be able to say, this is good enough. It's time to move on to the next thing. Certainly not saying that you shouldn't care about your work and be passionate about it and work hard at it, but it's better to create something that's bad than not create anything at all. And if you're constantly focusing on making things perfect, you will never finish anything. You'll never finish a music piece. You'll never finish a game. You'll just be constantly fixing things endlessly.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think one that in particular can um, be helpful to folks who are just starting out, as far as like
Mm-hmm.
combining that advice with, as you mentioned earlier, some of the classic advice for beginners of like make small projects. I
Mm-hmm.
think is the reason why that advice exists, the make small project advice, because
Yeah.
the whole point is like getting something under your belt, finishing it can not only be informative, but it can also be inspiring to keep going.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, great advice. Well, if you couldn't already tell, HorrorVale is a resounding success in my book. I'm excited to keep playing
Mm-hmm.
it and hopefully finish it. If you had a blank check or just, all the time in the world, what would be
Mm-hmm.
next for you? Is it HorrorVale 2? Is it another turn-based RPG? Something else entirely? Where are kind of your next aspirations lying in game development?
Mm-hmm. Well, technically, I am already working on the next iteration in the HorrorVale universe. It's called HorrorVale Act M, which is a spin-off title, which kind of tells the story of HorrorVale, but from a different perspective. It was originally going to be kind of like a DLC kind of thing until
Mm-hmm.
it is kind of went off, and now it's become its own game. Although it's going to be significantly smaller. But essentially, it tells the story of Mothman in the game. So you'll get to see a lot of the events of HorrorVale from his perspective, and also brand new things that you didn't know about. And it's also an opportunity for me to experiment with things about HorrorVale that maybe I wanted to try something different on, like for example, like how the progression is structured, how you progress through the game. So in Act M, well, in HorrorVale, in a lot of cases, you enter this big area. There's some kind of gate or obstacle in the way, and it says, okay, you have to go turn off these generators, or you have to go find this. Like it gives you an open area with a bunch of goals you have to go do. And in Act M, it's a little bit different because Mothman is a bounty hunter. So
Mm-hmm.
he's trying to collect as many bounties as he can. So it's almost like a kind of like Banjo Kazooie Super Mario 64 kind of system where you have an obstacle where you have to collect a certain number of bounties to progress. So you go out into the world and you find these monsters, and you can get all of them if you want to, but if there's some that are annoying, you can just get some of them and then progress that way. Um, Although Act M isn't necessarily a full-on sequel, certainly I feel like the door is open. HorrorVale, it has a very large universe. If I wanted to do some like a proper sequel starring Alice and really expanding that universe, I certainly could. I would love to, especially with infinite time in the world. Uh, but I mean, we'll just have to see. I certainly can't say for sure that there will or won't be a sequel, but I would love to make something like that. I've also
Yeah.
thought that maybe I have considered making something that's a little bit like I do want to make other games besides JRPGs just to kind of expand my horizons and try different stuff, not necessarily large games. I've had a
Hmm.
few ideas here and there, like, oh, I could do something that's like life sim, or I could make
Hmm.
something that's like multiplayer cooperative, or I could make a traditional horror game where it's actually supposed to be scary kind of thing. Nothing set in stone yet, but I'm always thinking of new ideas, and I'm always wanting to make new things. I love creating, so I don't think there's ever going to be a point where I stop.
That's great. And it's also great to hear that you have kind of the core of HorrorVale to go back to, whether it's
Mhm.
one of the things I've been fascinated by diving into RPG Maker stuff and that scene a little bit more is how like people can bend the engine to what they want to do. So like there's a lot of
Mhm.
people who are really invested in like just horror
Mhm.
games in RPG Maker, and I think that's fascinating. But that's another idea that came up for me when you're talking about like maybe making a straight up horror game or life sim or what have you, is like you could do it in RPG Maker, you could do it in a different engine, and just like seeing how your game development journey progresses is something that's going to be
Yeah.
fascinating to me. And I hope I get to see it all the more so if anyone listening to this can go and support Dustin's work by picking up HorrorVale on Steam now. It's an awesome game, and
Yeah.
I'll be leaving the link in the
Oh,
show
thank
notes
you.
to go do that. Yeah. So they definitely should do that. Something I recommend. And to close, I have two questions.
Okay.
One you already know about, and one I'm just coming up with off the dome.
Uh-oh.
Do you want me to ask the one about pets first, or the secret one first? Your choice.
We can do the pets question first.
Well, I did a little snooping on your Instagram, and I
Mhm.
found a wonderful variety of pet pictures.
Mhm.
And I was wondering, like, what role animals play in your life? Do they influence your creative vision? Because I can tell, like, a lot of the playfulness in Horrorvale could somewhat be related to, a
Mhm.
love of animals. And I see your cat in the background here, so cute. And so I was just wondering, like, what your relationship with animals is like.
Yeah, so I've always loved animals ever since I was a kid. A lot of the animals that you probably see on there are not actually mine, but friends' animals. Or I've worked at a pet store for over a
Hmm.
decade now, and a lot of them are from that. Um, I have two cats. One of them is actually named Alice, based off of
Oh.
the. You would think that the character in the game would be named after my cat, but it was the opposite. I came up with the character first, and then when I adopted my cat, I named her after the character. And
Cute.
there is actually an instance where I don't know if you did this side quest, but there's a side quest where you go in a mirror and there's like a maze that's kind of Alice in Wonderland inspired,
Yeah.
and there is a giant cat in there that's kind of meant to be like the Cheshire Cat, but it's just my
Hmm.
cat with a creepy smile.
Aw, that's awesome. I love that referential Easter egg. It's gorgeous. Um, well, cool. Secret question is I am smitten with your whole background vibe right now. You've got a very organized shelf. You've got a
Yeah.
plushy cat tree, and you've got the Luigi's Mansion poster. This is what I can see. And I know you mentioned also like collecting horror films as well. So I was wondering, like, just generally, like, what your relationship with physical media is. Tell me more about this beautifully organized shelf behind you. It's just something I'm fascinated in. So more a question for me.
Yeah, so this actually is not normally here in my bedroom. This is they're renovating the kitchen and living room right now, so I just moved it out of here. But yeah, I've always been an aficionado of physical media. I've never been a big fan of the digital age. Obviously, HorrorVale is a digital game on Steam, but it's always been a dream of mine. If I could one day have a HorrorVale case on my shelf, that would be like a dream come true. Or I would probably just frame it. I love collecting stuff. I love having just something physical on your shelf, and I feel like something that really the game industry is losing is there was once a time where you go to the store, you buy a game, and no matter what, even if the internet is down, you just pop the game in and you play it. And we're now entering an age where that's not necessarily the case, even when you buy physical games. And a lot of times, especially, not so much with Nintendo, but like PlayStation and Xbox, especially, you buy a disc and there's actually nothing on the disc. It just installs the game from the internet. And there's definitely something that's being lost there because it really limits things, because if those servers ever go down, a lot of them will allow you to still download the game after the actual ability to purchase it is taken away, but eventually that's going to go away too. Meanwhile, I still have a original NES that still works. You can still plug it in and play it. The cartridges work still fine. And it's probably going to continue that way for a long time if I continue to take care of it.
What are some of your favorite things to collect? I know you mentioned horror movies. It sounds like some NES games you still have. Anything else you want to shout out?
Yeah. So I like I said, I collect horror games. I feel like I haven't collected as much games as I used to. On this shelf right here, there's a very significant chunk of it is like GameCube, Wii, N64, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3.
Hell yeah.
And then as the generations go on and I get older, there's less and less and less. I do have a very large collection of Zelda merchandise. Zelda is probably my favorite franchise of all time. I own every single game. And I've got all kinds of figures and stuff strewn about everywhere. Like just off of the arm's reach, I got a little Majora's Mask here. Yeah, I'm a sucker for. There's another bookshelf here you can't even see. It has all of the Zelda manga on it. It has all the books that they've sold, all kinds of stuff.
Amazing. Well, I'll stop grilling you, but Dustin, thank you so very much for being on the show today. It was wonderful to chat with you, and
thank you for having me on. It's been great.
Yeah. And like I said, for folks who are listening, go buy HorrorVale. It's a wonderful game, and there's you have all the reasons in the world to support Dustin. And that was Dustin Andrews. A very soft-spoken, humble, and wonderful person. I really enjoyed my chat with him, and one of the things that just kept coming up in my mind was how wonderful it is that he wanted to make a game, and he just made the game. You know, he just made it work. He's working at a pet store. He's messing around with RPG Maker. His friend is interested in music. And at some point, he was just like, why the hell not? And he did it. And it's so good. It really is so good, folks. HorrorVale. I'm going to be putting the Steam page in the show notes for you all to go check out. Please, please, please buy it if you have the means. It's wonderful. It's homemade. It's hand-drawn. It's very Dustin, and I think that's pretty close to being as good as you can get. So, Dustin, thanks so much for being on the show, and thank you folks for listening. I will also put horrorvale.net in the show notes. That's kind of the little website that they have set up for HorrorVale, and there you can join the Discord and the wiki and all those kinds of things. So please do check all that stuff out. I think it would be great if Dustin did have the blank check that we talked about at the end and all the time to make his next project, because the world needs his art. And I loved his philosophy also on making something is better than not making something, regardless of the quality of that thing. And I think it has led to an undeniably quality and memorable product in HorrorVale. So, once again, just expressing my gratitude for HorrorVale, that it exists, that Dustin exists, and shared his joy with us today on the show. Haven't said it in a couple episodes, but this show is all about rooting joy in games, using those roots to destroy internet apathy, and the earnestness and joy with which I just conducted that conversation, and the earnestness and joy which Dustin inspires, certainly takes steps toward achieving that goal. As far as updates for my little gaming spiel this week, my partner Jamie and I have recently switched our podcast name. So we do another podcast called Bargain Bin, formerly called Bargain Bin. Now it is called Game Joy, like Game Boy, but you just switch the B for a J. And you can probably tell that Game Joy is something that I'm interested in, it being kind of the premise of this show too, from a different perspective. And over there, Jamie and I are just going to talk about games we've been playing, kind of an extended version of this spiel each week, but with a partner and with lively conversation, and we get weird, and the show is mostly just about hanging out. So if you are into that kind of thing, and if you like listening to gaming podcasts, I think you'll enjoy it, so go ahead and check it out. As far as the gaming stuff I've been doing, I dipped back into my PS Vita hacking phase, and so this was my arc with it. I bought a Vita because it's kind of this totemic piece of technology in my mind as an undersupported handheld that had all of these, new updated features for when it came out in kind of the mid-2010s. And the successor to the PSP, which is a handheld that I have a lot of reverence for. And it's just this weird little thing. It has a touchscreen. It's kind of like an early smartphone in a way, but it also has analog sticks and has all of the Sony glitz and glam. And so I was like, let's get it. I know there's a super popular modding scene, and I've talked about this in a previous episode, so you can go back and listen to that if you want. But basically when I got it and I started poking around with it, I soft modded it and started to put games on it, I was like, wow, this actually kind of sucks, because folks, lo and behold, I had accidentally bought a fake SD card. So I thought I was getting a good deal on a 256 gig memory SD card, but I actually had like a 30 gig one that had 256 printed on it and Samsung printed on it, when likely it was just a knockoff. And so that was something I didn't realize until I, poked around and did some searching and was like, I'm pretty sure this is the issue. So I was feeling pretty burnt out at that point because nothing was really working well thanks to the SD card being so crappy. I put it away, put it in a drawer. As you heard last week, I had plenty of other things to tinker around with the PS2 coming in, and my growing fascination with retro tech. But after conquering the PS2, I was thinking, and I was like, I think if I just get a real micro SD card, the PS Vita is going to work like a charm. And so I did that. I ate the cost for that, and came in yesterday, and I started playing around with it, and I basically, long story short, had to redo the whole soft modding process, which took a couple of hours. But now that I have that up and running, the actual downloading of games and the way games function on the Vita is so much improved. I can really see where people are coming from now, and it's been a lot smoother process. So I'm really excited to dig into the Vita catalog. There's some hidden gems on there, and also a lot of indies that I have blind spots for. So like I'll play Hotline Miami on there. I'll hopefully get into some visual novel adjacent stuff with like Chaos Child and the Danganronpa series, and it'll be a pleasure to play particularly Danganronpa on its kind of original intended hardware. Gravity Rush is something I'm excited to dig into. So while I have had little rants on this show before where I've been like, just go play, in the act of play, it's also about like important to set yourself up for a playing environment that you are excited about. So I'm excited about the Vita again, and I'm slowly working my way toward having my ideal Vita setup. The only other thing I might be updating on this show, if I do delve into it, is fixing the battery. I'm pretty sure the battery life on my Vita is like crap, just because it's pretty old at this point. So I might try to replace the battery and become a real tinkerer, or I might just try to keep it plugged into the wall. I don't know, but that's the only thing that I'm a little unhappy with that I will be futzing around with a bit in the coming days. As far as game stuff and other things I'm playing, I dipped into the NBA Street on the GameCube where you can unlock Mario and Luigi, oddly enough, in this EA title. It was fine. I always like to have like a sports game to fiddle around with. I've realized that like one of the things I I realized, especially last week talking to John Lansing about fantasy football tactics, is that I really do love sports games, and I always like to have one kind of on the back burner just to pop in and out of when I'm watching TV or something. And that's really how I got my start in gaming, is like Mario Baseball on the GameCube was like my first true love in games. And I remember when I got my GameCube for the holidays, my parents had to a number of times prevent me from sneaking downstairs in like the middle of the night at like 3 a.m. to boot it up and play it. And that was like the most rebellious I have ever been in my entire life. And I did that for Mario Baseball on the GameCube. And so I'll continue doing that and channeling that in what I emulate. I finally got like a full catalog of PSP games working on my Steam Deck, so that's another outlet for my little PSP foray. Jamie played Bubblegum Galaxy, which is this cool game that I highlighted in my last Indie Game Discover Weekly YouTube video. But it's kind of like this cozy strategy light game where you can decorate your office, and the conceit is that you destroyed the galaxy by accident by pressing like the delete button on one of your computers, and now you have to rebuild it hex by hex. And the colors are beautiful. I love colors in games. I've been thinking a lot about tropical games recently, especially as we get more into spring and almost summer now, which is wild to be saying. But I'm just so grateful for the earnestness with which games can help us feel and approach the world, and that's something I've also been getting a little bit more in touch with as I've developed a kind of meditation and yoga routine each morning, which is helping me recommit to my creative projects and just recommit to a lot of the things that bring me joy in life. So if that sounds good to you, I'm using the Headspace app. It's something that my therapist recommended, and I had always been like kind of skeptical, honestly, of like Calm and any app that like monetized mental health. I still don't love it, but I do plan on getting I'm on a trial right now, but I do plan on getting like the full year subscription, just because as a daily companion for making sure I feel whole and connected to my body and brain, I think it's pretty invaluable. So if you've been skeptical like me, but you're interested in finding a place to meditate, they have like a whole beginner course on it, and I've really been enjoying it and excited to provide updates on that journey too. I've also dipped into a couple phone games, staying on the phone and apps. I had a bit of a an app shopping spree the other day when I was like fascinated by the pixel art from the Drifter, so I got PicSquare on my iPad and I've been tooling around with that. I got Guncho, which is a stellar tactical roguelike. I got Downwell finally after a lot of folks have told me to get Downwell, and the phone is the best place to play it. And I also re-engaged with a little chess.com app because, you know, I am a boy, and I do like the strategies, even though sometimes my brain don't work so good. So that's that. I mean, hey, thank you so much for listening to now. I'm losing it. Thank you so much for listening to now. If you have, you've probably enjoyed this show so far, and I am so grateful for that. You probably hear this spiel a lot if you listen to my episodes, but please tell one friend. I don't do anything to market the show, so telling one person and word of mouth is the vehicle for that. You can also give me a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, give me a review on Apple Podcasts, that would help a lot, or follow my YouTube channel at Indie Game Garden. I'm also on Blue Sky if you want to get in touch at Darth Malks. Thank you so much again for listening. Thank you so much to Dustin for being on the show today, and please, please, please do go buy HorrorVale. It'll be in the show notes. It'll just be a few clicks, and it would mean a lot to Dustin and myself. Okay, see you next time. Bye.